Hello everyone, for today's video is about aperture and I'll be explaining what aperture is and going through everything with you to just demonstrate how aperture affects certain aspects in photography and film. So hope you enjoy. So what is aperture? So in photography, aperture refers to the opening of the lens's diaphragm through which light passes. So it's basically when lens the amount of light you can let in through a lenses through the lens basically. So it is calibrated in f-stops and generally written in numbers such as 1.4, 2.8, 4, 5.6, 8, 11, and 16. It goes up to 60. But there's some that go beyond go up to 22. But it depends what camera you get. So and that's when the maximum number could depend on that. So lower f-stops give more exposure because they represent larger apertures, and higher ones give less exposure because they represent small apertures. So this might be contradictory to you, but when you start taking photographs, it becomes more clear because you can see the difference. So here I'm showing you a few images. This is one image that I found to demonstrate this. So you can see this one here. So the bigger the lens, the wider the lens cap's opened, the more light you allow through. Then you see this one. It's the size of the hole small because you're letting in less light, and it goes down. It decreases. The number's high. The higher the number, the increase. The smaller it gets, basically. And this goes same. This same here. So you can see this diagram here, this line saying wide, and it goes all the way down to 22. Because I did say earlier on that it depends which number. Depends on the camera you get, I think. And that's when the f-stop goes up to 22 and not just up to 16. So when you see a wide aperture, this image says that light flows and the image is less in focus. So the shallow depth of field occurs. So basically, the background is blurred out, but you can still see the person, but it's not in focus. And the light funnels in, and more it's in focus. So meaning that the deeper depth of field occurs. So you can see both. Everything's in focus basically. I think it's because of the amount of light you let in. The aperture is smaller. That's why. And this is the last image. So you see it goes up to 22 again. And you can read all of this. I will just leave it there for you to read and visualize. So how does aperture affect the depth of field? So the depth of field is the zone where the acceptable sharpness in front of and behind the subject on which the lens is focused. So put that in layman's terms is how sharp or blurry the area of the subject is, basically. That's what it is. So the lower the f-stop, the larger the opening of the lens. The less depth of field, the blurrier the black background. So I showed you the image. So you see that the wide lens represents that. So when the lens is wide, there's less depth of field, so therefore the background is very difficult to see because everything's out of focus except that subject itself. So the higher the f-stop, smaller the lens opening of the lens, and the more depth of field, the sharper the background. So the background will be more or less in focus with that image. When the lens becomes more narrow, so you can see the difference basically. With the first image, it's about small aperture, meaning depth of the deep depth of field, and the large aperture is the shallow depth of field. So you see here everything's in is out of focus on the second half. The first half is more in focus, so you get to see the details of the background. So how aperture affects exposure. So aperture has several effects on how a photograph looks. So one of the most important elements to really consider is brightness or exposure of the images. So as it appears that the aperture does change in size because it alters the amount of light that reaches into the camera sensor. Therefore, the brightness of the image. So basically, when the camera reaches the so basically it's a bit similar to what I said before. Like the size of the lens can affect how a photograph looks basically. So because the sensors of the camera picks it up, even though you've done the settings already, it does detect the amount of light you're putting in or you set it to basically. So a large aperture will pass a lot of light, therefore resulting in a brighter photograph. So basically the photograph's more exposed and it's more white, like a whitish colour basically. It's a bit washed out, let's say. I think that would be the best way to describe it. So and a small aperture does the opposite thing, making the photo dark. So here's the image that demonstrates what that is. So the middle one is actually to know how the image originally looked. So they changed the aperture basically to see how it affects the look of the image. So the first one is the large aperture. Basically, the image is, as I said, washed out, and the small aperture is basically makes the photo darker. So yeah, so because you're letting in less light, that's why the photo looks like that. I think the large one, it just reminds me of the sci-fi films that purposely use. I think mainly sci-fi films, also fantasy films, and they mainly use like they purpose deliberately put made the exposure of the lights happen. But I don't know if they're doing it through special effects or through green screen or whatever. So I think that's what it is, maybe. So how aperture affects shutter speed. So using a low f-stop, meaning more light enters through the lens. So the shutter doesn't need to stay open for long because the correct exposure is set, translating to a faster shutter speed. So the reverse is also the case with the higher f-stop being that it allows light to enter through the lens, meaning that the shutter doesn't. But the problem is the shutter has to stay open a little longer, resulting in a slower shutter speed. But I can't. I don't know if I have the image. I think I do have an image for this one. So basically, 1 in 16. Now that's the shutter speed. That means the shutter speed is quite slow. Let's say, and the other. Oh no. I think low f-stop, large aperture, less depth of field. So you could see what this image is trying to say. So high f-stop, small aperture, greater depth of field. Because they kind of change. You change just shutter speed as well to make it more, you know, better quality, I guess, or more dark, I would say. I think it this image says it all. Basically, this is what I was referring to when it comes to aperture affecting the shutter speed. So basically, the first image, you know, is much faster. So you don't get the quality of the movement as you do with the last one. The last one, the movement is quite. It makes it look nice. I like it like that, and it makes it more crisp. And the middle one, that's how it normally looks. So the slower shutter speed basically made this image look smoother, make the waterfall more smoother in terms of its movement. And this made it more less in sync, I would say, maybe more natural looking, or I don't know how to describe it, the first one. So choosing the right aperture, so now we know how to control the depth of field, what demonstrates what demonstrates the choices we make in selecting the aperture. So we use focus and depth of field to direct attention to what is important in the photograph, and we use a lack of focus to minimize distractions that cannot be eliminated from the composition. So if you want to focus on a particular subject, but you don't want anything in the background that's appearing, you can actually blur it out. You actually change the aperture through use of depth of field. So it does create this effect. So the pineapple image shows that. So basically, there's no clouds. So the clouds, they didn't want the clouds because it's kind of distracting them, the image itself. But it does make the image washed out. And the second aperture, the sky's white, but there's no clouds because the person wants to eliminate any sort of background distraction. And it gets gradually darker as the lens gets smaller. That's what I'm trying to tell you. But it makes it less in focus, the backgrounds. But if you so it does have an impact on how you want the photo to look. You need to know the settings. You can use manual focus when you take pictures because you can control what you want in focus basically. Because the autofocus sometimes can't stabilize itself when you're filming on set. Sometimes it doesn't work out basically, and you have to try and You have to wait till it's still. So using large apertures at night. So I would say that it's better to use a large apertures at night rather than in the daytime. Because if you're filming or taking pictures at night and you can't see what you want to take pictures of or you want to film, you could simply use change the aperture basically to make it more to make the photo more easy to see basically. And that's and I'll recommend that. So I think that's what I would do. Change the aperture at night, not daytime. Because I'll leave it how it is. Unless I'm trying to eliminate distractions, I'll change it to depth of field. So here are the references. So I only used two references. But I'll say I'll prefer the second reference because, the second one has everything you need to know about the aperture. But if you want the link to that, I will leave it in the comments. I'll give it to you in the comments section. So thank you for watching. See you in the next video. Bye.